Here. Good deal. Okay. Yeah, so I assume people will probably keep trickling in here over the next couple minutes, but I'd like to go ahead and get started on time if we can. But like I was saying, I'm just very grateful for everyone who's joined us for this study. Tonight's the last evening together, and then we'll have the same discussion on Sunday morning for the final time. But this has been a very condensed study of the character of God. I have been excited about doing this. I'm very pleased with the way that it's all come together. And all the feedback has been positive, so thank you for that. But again, all of this content comes from the resources at the Bible Project. And so I'll repeat this at the end, but I do want to encourage you guys to actually check out the videos, the podcasts, the reading. This study continues. We did not get to faithfulness, but they just put out a video for faithfulness a couple weeks ago. And then they put out another video this week addressing the question, is God trustworthy? So I expect that they will continue along this line of thinking. If the trend that I've noticed with Tim Mackey is any indication, is that whenever he gets an idea for something, is he will continue to put out videos for it until it's done and fully fleshed out. So this has been a really great study. Again, all the materials have come from the Bible Project. And it's just a great resource for anybody who's looking to do some more in-depth study from somebody who knows what they're talking about, and wants to kind of further their own study goals. But appreciate you all joining. Tonight we'll be talking about God's loyal love. And as we come into the conclusion of the study, I want us to also be focused on what we've learned so far, because just as with anything else that we've studied, it is all very much interconnected. And even though we've gone through things very quickly, I feel like it's been very dense. And there are several little things that might be floating around in the back of your mind that need to be connected to other things. We'll try to do some of that tonight. But as you think about some of our discussions, starting with the context of this verse and the tension between a loyal and loving God and a rebellious people, much of what the world would have us believe about God is warped by that tension. Our own misunderstandings, our own misplaced feelings that come out of our rebellion against God can sometimes warp the way that we feel. And so a lot of people, unfortunately, come to the conclusion that God is not these things, even though he very much is, and we very much believe that he is, because of that tension, because we are rebellious, and because we sin so much. But where the world would have us see these negative sides of God, this angry, unmerciful God, we as Christians, because we have been subject to God's grace, we see a God who's really just loved us to death. And that death would be the death of Jesus Christ. His compassion led him to bring Jesus to earth in the first place. His compassion leads to his grace. Because he is compassionate, he's gracious. That was a very important idea that we talked about. But just because God is compassionate and gracious doesn't mean that he's not just. You can't let sin just stand. And when we sin, we do anger God, but God is slow to that anger. And God is justified in his punishment of sin, but he's also abundant in his forgiveness. And we have easy, frequent, abundant access to that forgiveness so long as we reject our sin and we turn back to God's covenant. Even though we might face the consequences of our sin, it's those consequences that should lead us back to God and should have us running back to him for restoration. So all of that really points to God's loyal love. Really nothing more needs to be said. You think about how compassionate and gracious and slow to anger and patient and faithful he is, and that sums up in a nutshell what exactly it is when we're talking about God's loyal love. But And it's God's compassion, it's his patience that perpetuates his loyal love and faithfulness. And vice versa, his loyal love perpetuates these other characteristics too. But we'll look tonight at specific examples of how the early Israelites viewed God's love. It might be a little bit different than what you think, and what it means when God says that he has loyal love for thousands, because that's we don't want to put too much weight on verse 6 here without looking at verse 7 as well. But the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loyal love and faithfulness, keeping loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. But he by no means leaves the guilty unpunished, responding to the transgressions of fathers by dealing with children and children's children to the third and fourth generation. Okay, let's get some discussion going. Okay. So thinking about love and loyalty and things of that nature, how would you define loyalty?
It is commitment.
Okay.
I was thinking commitment in regards to it doesn't matter, or it shouldn't matter what had happened. It's not, you can't be loyal and then if something bad happens, run away. I don't think loyalty works that way. So you got to stick through thick and thin.
Good deal.
Steadfast.
Steadfast is a good word for it. Yeah. And that's not a word that we use very often. It comes up in our discussions a lot in the church, I think. But if I think about the number of times that I've used steadfast in conversation, I might be able to count that on one hand. But it's very important. Very important. So I like to associate some quotes to some of these questions, but this is the only one I've got tonight. Loyalty means giving me your honest opinion, whether you think I'll like it or not. I think that's a pretty good way to put it, because if someone's loyal to that point, they're watching out for you at that point. Yeah, they're trying to check your blind spots and make sure that you're not getting too big of a head or not blundering into something without considering all the consequences. But and this might be a little bit one-dimensional, but I think loyalty encompasses all these things: being committed and sticking through thick and thin, and being steadfast no matter what happens, so you're not shaken. So considering that, what situations would you say that loyalty is the most important?
I think in marriage it's important. That comes close to some of the covenant ideas there for sure.
Absolutely. Marriage. What else? Maybe friendship. Maybe your employer. Lots of different ways. Yeah. It's and I would say a lot of our relationships are deeply dependent on loyalty. Probably more so than you might consider. But I mean, even your friendships, you may it's kind of difficult to think about loyalty and friendship in regards to having control over another person that you're friends with, because you don't really. Your friends can come and go, and frequently do, but sticking through those kinds of friendships and relationships, loyalty will probably come up a lot more than you might expect. So how would you know someone is loyal? I think we've kind of covered that already. But what about this? The thing about loyalty and trust. What's the relationship between those two things?
I think we have to trust in the person that they will be loyal. I don't know if I've ever just gone up to somebody and said, I feel like we have a lot of loyalty. I think it's just kind of like an unspoken trust agreement that I have with the people that I do feel loyal with.
That's an awkward thing to talk about. But yeah, it's an unspoken feeling. You know who you can trust. That's for sure.
The what I'm coming to my mind is, when you don't have to ask someone to trust you. It's all the time. It's just say, will you trust me this time? It's no, it's always. And loyalty is the same way. You're always loyal. It's not no such thing as a partial loyal.
Oh, that was another quote that I came across, and I thought about including it, but loyalty is one of these all-in things. You're either loyal or you're not. There's no spectrum of loyalty like what we talked about anger having a spectrum last week. But yeah, I agree with that. I think trust has a lot to do with earning loyalty. Loyalty is not something that's freely given or received. It often comes with strings attached or with a sense of obligation. So I think trust plays a big role in that, building trust and earning trust and being trustworthy over a long period of time, building up to the point of giving loyalty consistently. So here's a thought-provoking question. No answers are really required here unless you want to give one. But that being said about trust and loyalty, does unconditional love truly exist? Any thoughts on that? Maybe not. That's okay. But we'll watch the video tonight, and we'll talk about God's loyal love. And it is just as important as the rest of these, and just as powerful as well. So think about these things. We'll watch the video and then come back together and discuss.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this fourth phrase, loyal love. It translates the Hebrew word chesed, which is hard to translate into any language because it combines the ideas of love, generosity, and enduring commitment all into one. Chesed describes an act of promise-keeping loyalty that is motivated by deep personal care. Like in the story of Ruth. Ruth is a foreigner married to an Israelite man, but tragically, her husband dies along with his brother and his father. All Ruth has left is her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, who has nothing to give her. Naomi tells Ruth she should go back to her people, but instead, Ruth promises to stay by Naomi's side and take care of her. And as other people watch Ruth keep this promise over time, they call it an act of chesed. Notice that Ruth's chesed is not conditional or based on Naomi's worth. Rather, it's an expression of Ruth's character. She just is a generous and loving person who keeps her word. That's chesed. Now, Ruth's loyal love is truly inspiring, but the one who shows the most enduring chesed in the Bible is God. Like in the story about Jacob, who is a treacherous liar even to his own family. But despite that, God chooses him and repeats the promise he made to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, that he would have a huge family through whom God would restore his blessing to the nations. And so 20 years later, when Jacob realizes how undeserving he is, he says to God, "I'm not worthy of all the chesed you've shown me." And he's right. But God's chesed was never about Jacob's worth in the first place. It's a display of God's generous loyalty to his promise. God's chesed continues into the story of Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. When they're enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt, we're told that God remembered his promise to Abraham and Jacob, so God defeats Egypt and raises up Moses to liberate the people and lead them into the promised land. And in the story, this is called an act of chesed, because it was about God keeping his word. Now, on their way to the promised land, the Israelites are scared of the nations around them, and they doubt that God can protect them. So the people threaten to kill Moses and appoint a new leader to take them back to Egypt. God is understandably hurt and angry, But Moses steps in and says, "Forgive the sin of these people because of your great chesed." Notice that Moses asked God to forgive not because the people deserve it, but because it's consistent with God's own character. And God agrees, and he recommits himself to a people that don't want to be committed to him. In the Bible, God is loyal and loving for no other reason than it's just who God is. Of course, he wants his people to respond with chesed in return, but even when they don't, God's chesed remains. The prophet Hosea compared Israel's chesed to a morning mist that's here one moment and gone the next. But God's chesed is enduring. Like in the celebration of Psalm 136 that opens by saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good," and then 26 times repeats, "His chesed is forever." And so, after centuries of Israel betraying their commitment to God, and after humanity's long history of violence and death, God still kept his promise in a dramatic and drastic way by becoming human and binding himself to us in the person of Jesus. And the people who followed Jesus of Nazareth said that in him they encountered the God of Israel, who is full of loyal love and faithfulness. Jesus is the ultimate loyal and loving human. And in his life, death, and resurrection, God opened up a new future for all of us and for all of creation. And God did this because it's just who God is: generous, loving, and eternally loyal to his promises. And when we experience the purity and power of God's loyal love shown through Jesus, it compels us to reimagine why and how we can show chesed back to God and to the people around us. This is what it means to say that God is overflowing with loyal love.
Okay, so we're obviously talking about something it's got something to do with loyalty, and it's got something to do with trust, and it's got something to do with love, and a covenant, and really it's a loaded idea. So more Hebrew tonight, and again, I don't believe there's anything magical about knowing another biblical language. It is all talking about the same thing, and we can understand it in English. But it's kind of like the way that we use the word love in our day to day. Love's got a wide range of uses in different contexts, and this is a very similar word. Do I love potato chips? Yes. Do I love my wife as much as I love potato chips? No. I love her as much as I love potato chips, and so much more. So it's this whole idea of this covenantal relationship-driven word that has something to do with mercy, goodness, steadfast love. Okay, so there's that word again. In the KJV, you might see it as loving kindness. What does that even mean? It's a 14-letter word here that somebody just made up and smushed two words together. It's a kind love, I guess, but how is it any different from love? NET translates it as loyal love, and that's how we've kind of been presenting it throughout this study. And I think that's a pretty fair translation because of some of the context that this comes up in. But this is a word that is demonstrating loyalty to a relationship. It's demonstrating this desire to preserve and protect and to make a relationship flourish, which is love. But it's a love that is consistently happening over and over and over again. It's not referring to any one specific action, but a whole wide range of actions where love could come up and be in a scenario and have a deep impact. It's this posturing that you have toward the relationship where you want to express your love in different ways, in any way that is required. You want to express your love in any way that it's required. And so that's kind of how it comes up, and we'll take a look at a few of these as we go through it. But you might recognize some of these verses because they're really impactful. But just I'm going to try to pronounce it accurately. You really got to start it in the back of your throat. So chesed. But your chesed, Lord, reaches to the heavens, your faithfulness to the skies, your righteousness is like the highest mountains, your justice like the great deep. Okay, so thinking about love and the way that we use it, yeah, I mean, the psalmist provides no other contextual clues of how he wants to use this word, how it might be translated into English. Love could be here, mercy could be here, kindness could be here, loving kindness could be here. But the fact of the matter is, he's praising God for this this act of continual caring love. Okay, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. His chesed endures forever. Okay, you might recognize this and have it memorized in the NIV because it says His love endures forever. I think that's a song that we've probably sung that before. But it's this idea of this mercy, this goodness, this kindness that is ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. Just several different verses like this, and any of these words that we saw on the last slide could fit into these scenarios. I think context provides some clues that makes some more important than others, like Micah. This is a great verse for this example because he says, okay, he has shown you, O human, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To do justice and to love chesed and to walk humbly with your God. Can you love? I think you can, but mercy is probably the most common that you'll see here translated in this verse, because he's talking about justice and mercy in response to justice is kind of an odd thing. When we think justice, we think punishment or sentencing, but seeing mercy in relationship to justice makes a lot of sense here. But if you think about it, so does love, so does kindness, so does steadfast love or loyal love, because that's what God does for us. Whenever he provides mercy, he is providing his loyal love. So it's really interesting to kind of think about the different ways that you might see this. And whenever you see a word like this that's translated in different ways in different translations, it's kind of an opportunity for you to say, aha, well, there's something interesting here and something to dig into, and you can learn a lot from it. But just a lot to think about there. Any thoughts or comments on that? Okay, well, we'll move on, and we'll take a look at some of the acts that where this comes up. All right, so very similar to compassion, it shows up in this kind of like 80%, 20% proportion, where 80% of the time it's in reference to God, 20% of the time it's in reference to humans. But when we do it, there's some categories here that come up. So when people do chesed, when they fulfill their commitments to another person in their family or their kinship network, long way of saying people will do anything for their family. Blood is thicker than water. I think Tommy, you mentioned that recently. Yeah, I mean, when we think about our family, we've got this sense of obligation that yes, we should love them. But what we see is that a true act of chesed is what we see in Ruth. Whenever Ruth performs the way that she does in her book, it's described as this act of loyal love. And if you remember that story, like the video said, her husband died, her brother-in-law died, her father-in-law died, and it just left her sister-in-law, and her mother-in-law. And her sister-in-law, her mother-in-law was very kind and said, "There's no reason for you to stick around here. You should leave. You should go back to your home." They were from the land of Moab. So Orpah leaves, her sister-in-law, but Ruth has this very deep feeling statement that she makes, and it's often quoted in weddings or things like that, but really it's different context. But I'm trying to find it here. Yeah, so Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." Naomi's being nice and trying to give Ruth a way out, but Ruth in turn responds with this very passionate statement. It's almost an oath where it says, "Absolutely not. I am staying with you and I am becoming one of you in the deepest way possible." And then later on, when Ruth is with Boaz and trying to set up that marriage arrangement between them, Boaz remarks on her chesed. He remarks that she is a woman of excellence because she has pursued him, basically. So, and she's doing that to support her family too. It's not like not necessarily a romantic pursuit between Ruth and Boaz, but because Ruth and Naomi are on their own and they need somebody to guide and protect them. A kinsman redeemer, I think, is the way that it's described in the Bible. But that is an act of hesed in Ruth because she's trying to provide for Naomi. She's trying to rebuild her family. And so that's incredible that, you know, she was trying, Naomi was trying to send Ruth away, but she said no and even went further and tried to provide for them. Okay, so people do hesed when they fulfill their commitment to someone they've made a covenant agreement with. People stick to their word. And that this may seem cheap in this discussion because we make agreements all the time, and a lot of them don't mean a whole lot. But this is different in that it's talking about a covenant agreement, which we don't really do that these days. But think about David to Jonathan. Two guys as best buds as could ever be, loved each other deeply as brothers, and to the point where they made oaths to each other that they would take care of each other and each other's families for as long as they could make that happen. So if you remember the story of David and Jonathan, as that story progresses, Jonathan sadly dies, and as David rises to the status of king, he remembers his covenant to Jonathan. And he sends his servant out looking for somebody who is a member of Jonathan's family so that he might take care of him and honor his covenant. And so he finds Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, King Saul's grandson, and is kind to him, extremely kind, because Mephibosheth is lame. He cannot walk. But David adopts him. He straight up adopts Jonathan's son, takes him into his home and says, "You'll live as one of my own. You'll eat at my table," which is incredible. Incredible story of love and hesed. So people do hesed when they treat someone as if they're in a committed relationship, even if they're not. Okay, so again, we're thinking about obligations that we have and how we might treat somebody that we feel obligated to, but somebody treating somebody with this kind of loyal love who we're not in a relationship at all with them. A good example of this is Pharaoh's cupbearer to Joseph. You remember that Joseph foretold out of the cupbearer's dream that he would return to Pharaoh's side. And Joseph asks the cupbearer to have hesed and to remember him whenever he's back at Pharaoh's side. Sadly, the cupbearer doesn't remember to do that, but Joseph uses this word to ask for a loyalty, a kind of remembrance, and to make a loose covenant of just asking him to have, out of the kindness of his heart, a remembrance of Joseph in his pitiful situation in jail. Another great example of the spies who are spying on Jericho, and Rahab protects them, but then she turns around and asks them to have hesed and to remember her, and they do later on and rescue Rahab and her family. So a few observations from that. We pretty well established this, but Hesed is an act of loyal love. This loyal love is it's nice to say that somebody has loyal love, but what God does with it is He acts on it. It's when somebody treats someone else as close as a friend or family member, or is doing what is necessary to ensure their well-being and is being invested in the relationship. Okay, and we oftentimes, when we think about somebody who's doing that, we might feel a sense of obligation or duty, but really this is just coming out of a place of emotional motivation, an emotional love that motivates and drives somebody to have an overabundant expression of generosity and care. And that's exactly what God has for us. When we talk about God's loyal love, He has no obligation to do what He does for us. He has no obligation. He had no obligation to raise up somebody from David's line to be the Messiah. And even further back, He had no obligation to rescue the Israelites. He had no obligation to let them carry the tabernacle. He had no obligation, and so on and so on and so on, because we are a rebellious people. But God's Hesed informs Him otherwise. Because He's loyal and loving, He is gracious and slow to anger and all these other things as well. So yes, it refers to the emotional motivation of love that drives generosity and care. And again, it comes from a place that, whereas whenever we have these relationships, it might feel like a transaction. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But the person who is invoking Hesed is just doing it out of the goodness of their heart. Ruth was called a woman of excellence because she did these things for Naomi just out of the goodness of her heart. Nobody was driving her to do these things. Nobody drove the spies to rescue Rahab. Nobody drove David to, once he was king and had all these responsibilities, to remember poor little Mephibosheth and try to rescue him. Okay, so this comes up over and over again throughout the Bible as we think about God's loyal love to us. And so many good human examples of what humans can do to each other, but that helps us understand what exactly it is that God has done for us as well. Any comments so far?
Hey, Matt, one thing I'm struck about during this conversation is when I was giving my example of what I felt like loyalty was, I think my mindset was you show loyalty. I think what you're saying is you almost are loyalty. Calling it a character attribute versus something that you do from time to time is a big difference. So I've been thinking about that. I appreciate that distinction of it just being who you are and not something you do. So appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Matt, got a comment.
Yeah, go for it.
If you think of God and man going into a contract with each other, and when one party doesn't hold up to the contract, us being rebellious, that should release the other party from his end of the contract. But God, he doesn't take his out that he could. He is loyal. And
Yeah,
it means a lot to me because us use the word rebellious. We're the ones that broke the contract.
absolutely. Man, that is such a great example. They teach us about contracts in school, and that's exactly right. When one party does not uphold their end of the contract, the other party is released from all obligation. Nothing else is required. And you could take that person who broke the contract back to court and just throw the book at them. But that is not what God does with us. He does the exact opposite. All right, so I'm going to try to give us another 10 minutes here, and I know I've been going along with some of these discussions, but so we'll go through these next few slides pretty quickly. But the main thing I want you guys to get out of this one is starting to think about how God continually provides his loyal love. It's not just a one-time thing. And throughout the entire narrative of the Israelite people, thinking about how we started from Adam and Eve and ended up at Jesus, and how that whole narrative is one big act of God's loyal love. Starting off with Adam, which led to Abraham, which led to Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel, and how they felt, and how that led to David, and then that whole dark age period of slavery where God remained loyal to those people. And even on the back end of that period, when Jesus hits the ground running, that whole narrative is God's biggest loyal act of chesed for us. But he promises Abraham that he's going to bless him and give him a large family over several generations. He watches after Isaac and makes sure that Abraham's servant finds a marriage partner for Isaac, and that's an interesting story because the servant is actually looking for a young lady who goes above and beyond in the same way that we would expect somebody with chesed would have. Jacob spends his early life cheating and destroying his family relationships, and doesn't come back to reconcile with Esau until much, much later. But all throughout that time, God is loyal to him. God is interacting with Jacob and having all these really interesting conversations and interactions with Jacob because he's blessed this family, and God is staying loyal to that. When Israel finds themselves in slavery, he rescues them. The whole narrative from Exodus through Leviticus there, Deuteronomy and Numbers, forgives Israel in Numbers. And here is an interesting story because they are actually about to kill Moses, but Moses intercedes again. Okay, that idea of Moses being the intercessor comes back up again here in Numbers 14. But it just over and over and over again, God is protecting the Israelite people and staying loyal to them. Because ultimately we know he's going to save the world through the Israelite story. So that is really just one big showing of what exactly it is God's about, trying to save his people. This is great to think about how God's chesed comes up in the Psalms. The biblical writers in Psalms pretty much just view life as being fragile, and how we're always surrounded in life by threat and calamities and enemies and weaknesses to ourselves. But all of these people consistently plead to God to save them by his chesed, by his loyal love. They can constantly return back to God because they know that he is loyal, and they know that he is loving. They recognize that loyal love is so effective for hedging them against these disasters. It's so effective because they can depend on it. It's constantly there. They know from the beginning it has never wavered. They constantly depend on that and cry out to it and appeal to it because that's what they've come to believe. Yeah. Okay. So this is the other part. This is the verse 7 part of tonight's discussion. Okay. So God desires that his people show chesed to him, just as the same way that he has shown chesed to them. Okay. And in Hosea, this really comes up into play. I'll just read one of these. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no chesed, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There's only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. And God's response to that is basically, what can I do with you? I desire chesed, not sacrifice. Okay, so that's another verse that you've probably had memorized in the past, as I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And that is just God begging the people to remember that, to acknowledge Him, to stop having a lack of this loyal love that God has for them. So in the New Testament, it comes up in Mary's Magnificat. His mercy extends to those who fear Him from generation to generation. When you translate the Hebrew into Greek, you get this word, and this pretty definitely means mercy. It's not really used in any other situations. But it's interesting that Mary attributes His mercy in this way. Okay, it extends to those who fear Him from generation to generation. Again, we have that language of generational dependence on God's loyal love. Yeah, even though God warns the Israelites that He will have generation upon generation visiting their iniquities, that's just a prediction, because what we actually see playing out in the Bible is God consistently having a generation over generation of loyal love and faithfulness. Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 5. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world. But because of His great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive in Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace that you have been saved. Right. So interesting that these two words come up in conjunction with each other. So again, just thinking about the entire narrative, this is I got this from the materials, but basically what it's saying is that God carried out His loyal love by having an intimate relationship with the Israelites. And it started early on after creating the covenant with them by being present with them in the tabernacle. Very few other cultures in this area had that kind of intimacy with their gods. They would go up to the high places. They would go out into secret places. They would have a temple dedicated to it. But as the Israelites traveled, they brought their God with them. And it was this very real, very physical presence that God had amongst the Israelites that Jesus then mirrors with us. He first comes in person and lives His life, but now we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. God, the Word, became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so as God is fulfilling His loyal love through this intimate relationship with His people, and continually keeping tabs on them, and as they're going about their lives, protecting them, nurturing them, caring for them, Jesus is doing the same thing for us. But He's doing it in an even more effective way, because He has been the propitiation for our sins. And as we go about our lives and try to seek God's goodness, seek God's face, seek His righteousness, Jesus is there with us, indwelling with us. It's God's ultimate act of loyal love. And it's just a reflection of the covenants that He made with Abraham and Noah and David, because we have come to receive God's loyal love through Jesus. Our partnership with God has been restored because of what Jesus has done for us, and because of the loyal love that God has given us. Any comments? So that really concludes our discussion on God's loyal love tonight. I really appreciate you guys sticking with us. And just as we've gone through this, I hope that you have enjoyed it and just thought about more than just these 4 words, these 4 different ways that God describes Himself. We got to 3 of them. Okay, we did not get the faithful, even though that goes hand in hand with God's loyalty and his loyal love, his faithfulness. And it's strongly related to his truth and the true nature of how he enacts justice and love and mercy and these other things. But I got to brainstorming about how many different other characteristics are related to the ones that we discussed. And God's character is just constantly being revealed to us, and it is complex, but it's understandable, and it's something that we experience. All of these things are complex ideas. We could spend weeks discussing the character of God and appreciating God for who he is and what he's done for us. But each one of these could be its own study, but as we've gone through it, we've really just kind of hit them all in one way or another, just showing the fact that God is compassionate and gracious and slow to love, slow to anger, and is full of loyal love. God is just awesome in the way that he has chosen to reveal himself in ways that we understand, but have such an impact on us. It means so much to us in the way that we live our lives. So I want to thank you guys, and I want you guys to keep thinking about these things, and I hope that it goes on to be an encouragement for you as we go throughout this year.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
You have a good week.